Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Osman, and a very good afternoon to my co-panelists and other colleagues here in the auditorium. Of course, at the very outset, I'd really like to thank Dr. Abla, Ms. Miral Michel, and the team at ECES for convening the CAIRO Forum. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and the fact that this is my first time in Egypt, of course, makes it more so. So, good afternoon once again. Um, Dr. Usman, I'm really very happy to focus on the issue of digital public infrastructure, DPI, as we call it in India, because this really has been a major engine for digitalization and inclusive growth in the country. And as you rightly pointed out, this was a major push during India's G20 presidency last year. It was a really very important plank of discussions and activities. There was a declaration at the end of it. And all of that helped build on the momentum around DPI that had been building for the last few years anyway. And the G20 presidency allowed us to take that message to a much wider international audience, amplify the work that we had been doing and the possibilities it also holds for other countries who might want to work on DPI themselves. But I will focus on that a little later. And very recently, just 3 weeks ago, the Quad Leaders Summit was held in the US. And once again, the Quad Leaders Summit culminated in a set of Quad level principles for developing and deploying DPI. Once again, an indication of the importance that is being attached to this technological innovation across the world. And the idea was that this might actually benefit the Indo Pacific as a region. That was why the Quad Leaders Summit focused on this. But really, what exactly is DPI and what does it do? Now, broadly understood, DPI is a population scale technology system upon which our digital economy is built. But when you examine the idea more closely, you find that DPI really does three very specific things. It mediates the flow of people through digital identity, the flow of money through real-time fast payment systems, and also the flow of information through certain consent-based sharing, information sharing systems. What's important in India's case is that we actually became the first country to develop all these three foundational DPIs. So we have the Aadhaar Digital Identity Program. We have something called the Unified Payments Interface, which is our fast payment system, and also an architecture called the Data Empowerment and Protection Architecture, which focuses on consent-based sharing. Um, Now, all of this, these three building blocks, when taken together, and when these three levels interact with each other, well, the outcomes of this have been an absolute game changer for the Indian digital economy. So presently, Aadhaar, digital identity, is used by over 99.9% of India's adult population. And this also leads to certain secondary innovations. For example, Aadhaar, when used in conjunction with mobile phones and the mobile explosion in India, is being used to open bank accounts at scale. All right. And over the last few years, 530 million such bank accounts have been opened using mobile phones and digital identity. And this has allowed India to operate the world's largest financial inclusion scheme. Now, an interesting point here is that about 60% of these bank accounts that have been opened using digital identity are owned and operated independently by women. So clearly, you can see, there is a major push for women's empowerment and women's financial independence and inclusion also taking place because of our digital identity program. Uh, when we come to the unified payments interface, this fast payment system, for example, India is making 280 million digital payments every day, and about 80% of them are powered by the UPI platform. DEPA has, of course, changed the way online borrowing and lending sort of operates. And, this has also been very important. The concept of DPI has actually opened up the domestic private economy because powered by DPI, we have seen numerous homegrown startups flourish. I mean, there's actually a large number of multi-billion dollar unicorns operating in India now. And these are competing with global big tech firms, American big tech firms, neck at neck. And in some cases, actually also beating them at their own game. So these global tech incumbents are facing an onslaught of competition, the kind of which that they have not really faced before. Um, a metaphor we often use in India to describe DPIs is that of a railway track. All right, so the government has developed digital public infrastructure as a kind of railway track, and here trains are the sort of equivalent of the private sector companies. And, other companies that are using this DPI infrastructure to build their applications and solutions on top of them. Right? How does this entire system really work? There are two core operating principles. One has to do with the use of open application programming interfaces or APIs. And this allows businesses of all shapes and sizes to integrate with these three foundational services that DPI offer without having to invest much in infrastructure themselves. And this is quite a game changer because what it means is right from the beginning, a company can actually start focusing on innovation and value added services without actually having to invest much in infrastructure themselves. So really, the playing field has been leveled to a great extent, and companies are finding it easier to focus on niche markets right from the start of their development of business models, etc. Uh, the other core operating principle has to do with interoperability. And, DPI is allowing different kinds of companies, banking systems, digital wallets to operate seamlessly with one another, to operate interoperably with one another. And, this is great not just for user convenience, but it also boosts competition. It jumpstarts competition because companies are no longer locked into these proprietary systems or closed networks, which have always been the USP of, let's say, the big tech way of operating. There's a much more open ability to move across systems and platforms, and this is benefiting both people and businesses. Um, Digitalization and inclusive growth. Now the impacts of DPI have been absolutely palpable across sectors, and it's important to note that right from the beginning, digital public infrastructure has always had a very strong SDG orientation and a pro-poor orientation. One of the guiding beliefs has been that if you start catering for the bottom of the pyramid, the large mass out there, you will always find ways to tweak your solutions to adapt to more niche markets and wealthier markets. But if you start the other way around by focusing on class A and class B, as you said, sir, then it's going to be almost impossible to customize and tailor your solutions to meet the bottom of the pyramid. So India has chosen the latter approach. That has always been very clear. We will focus for the masses first, and then secondarily the more niche markets. And this has yielded strong dividends. I've spoken about cash transfers and access to finance, but health benefits are being transferred to a large bulk of our population. Educational scholarships are being made available through these bank accounts and other DPIs. It's also helping managing public payrolls by eliminating ghost workers and thus generating public servicings. And we have also, to a large extent, been able to clean up our voter registries by addressing this rather thorny issue of duplicate voters. The deduplication of voters is a problem most countries grapple with. And of course, DPI has spawned countless other innovations. One of them, and this deserves, I think, a particular mention, has to do with fintech. Today, because of digital public infrastructure in India, there are over 40 payment applications in operation in the fintech space. These are competing fiercely for market share, and as a result, quality is going up, while at the same time costs are constantly being driven down. But if you look at the hierarchy of who is leading the market, this is really quite telling. The top fintech operator in India is an Indian company called PhonePe. All right, they absolutely dominate the market. A distant second is Google Pay, and this was the first time, in 2017, that Google actually decided to design a product specifically for the Indian market because it was lured by the attractiveness of UPI. But do remember, there's a big gap between where PhonePe stands in the Indian market and where Google Pay stands. At third and fourth, you have Paytm, which is again another major Indian incumbent. This started well. It began life as a startup. It has now become one of India's most valued companies. And way below that, you have WhatsApp Pay and Amazon Pay, which are struggling to find a foothold. So this is a classic example of a technology which has actually allowed homegrown startups to flourish. All right, to the point where large transnational firms are struggling to keep up and compete in a similar way. Uh, Now, I will just come to the point about the G20 and international cooperation in a couple of minutes. Uh, So clearly, there has been, a well-demonstrated success of DPI in the last few years, and much of this has prompted certain other countries, not just in the developing South, but also in the global North, um, to sort of try and replicate this success and adapt and adopt DPIs. Now, this is happening in a number of different ways. Um, India already has bilateral relationships with a number of other countries in the global South. And we're actually helping these countries develop their own DPIs. All right. So we have MOUs in place with about 10 countries, and we are giving them access to parts of our DPI technology and architecture called India Stack and helping them to build their own national digital identity systems and other DPIs. We also have an online platform called MOSIP, which stands for the Modular Open Source Identity Platform, where again, we've partnered with a different spectrum of countries, about 15 of them. And we're helping them build their national digital identity systems from scratch with the understanding that, that the rest of the DPI architecture and all these other benefits I talked about will probably flow and follow from there. Um, but then you also have the global north. Now, interestingly, the US has shown a very strong interest in partnering with India on providing global leadership for DPI. This is noteworthy because, the US has always been historically a believer in digital private infrastructure. That has been the operating model. But it does see the clear potential of DPI as a plank for development in third countries. So the idea is that the US and India could actually cooperate, work together to roll out and support other countries with their development of DPI. The EU also has taken a somewhat mixed approach. I mean, certain European countries like Estonia, for example, have developed their own DPIs, strongly influenced in some cases by some of India's models. There are others like Germany, which is developing GovStack. Again, some elements of which share certain similarities with the Indian concept of DPI. But more broadly, Europe again, through the EU-India Trade and Technology Council has been very, very interested in partnering with India in third countries to sort of build capacities and roll out DPI programs. Um, the G20, gave all of this work a push. Oh, sorry, a third kind of cooperation has to do with these digital payment systems, UPI, where, the unified payments interface of India is now available in about 20 other countries, and NRIs, non-resident Indians, are being able to sort of make local payments and also sort of make remittances back to India using the UPI. The G20 gave all of this a big boost, right? And it did culminate in a high level set of principles around DPI. For the first time, what the G20 also did was it brought these 20 countries together and arrived at a common understanding and a definition of DPI. And this is important because, it is, if taken rather literally, a rather vague concept. So it was important to try and work towards what qualifies as a DPI and what doesn't. And then development efforts begin from there. Under the G20, we've also begun developing a global DPI repository. There are excellent examples of DPI from different parts of the world. It's just that some countries don't necessarily call them DPI, but then these are ideas, programs, and technologies that really do need to be shared with the world. So the idea is to consolidate all of this, put it into one place, and make it available for other countries to dip into as and when needed. And finally, of course, as I mentioned, the Quad Leaders Summit took place just 3 weeks ago. And this was a strong move to try and start popularizing the idea of DPI and what it might mean for digitalization and inclusive growth across the Indo-Pacific as a region. So I will end with that for the time being, sir, but happy to come back to any of these points later if needed. Oh yeah, I mean absolutely. I mean there is a strong need to focus on investing in digital public infrastructure because uh, it has the capacity to affect a larger population, really the entire population, 100% of a country's citizens, in a way that selective pieces of physical infrastructure like roads, highways, ports will never quite be able to do. So this is important. Now, the sustainability of DPIs is an important issue, and really, I think so. This is also what you are driving at. So far in India, I mean, DPIs have been financed by government, all right? But the question is that sustainable? So far, it has been. But going forward, alternative financing mechanisms also need to be explored. We need to look at the idea of privately provisioned public infrastructure, as it's called. Okay, where and airports are sometimes a good example of this, where air traffic The concept of an airport is developed by a government, but you actually have a private company running it. Can something like this also be considered for DPIs to make them more financially viable in the long run? These are models that we are looking at for sure.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you so much, sir, for actually setting the context of this question so well. Some 20 years ago, the journalist Thomas Friedman wrote a book called The World is Flat, which I think many of us in this room may have read. And The World is Flat was really a celebration of technology enabled globalization, how tech was actually bringing the world and people closer together. And that book was really a celebration of this phenomenon and the euphoria that went with it. Now, 20 years later, we've moved into a somewhat different era of globalization. Many of the trends that Thomas Friedman talked about then are now things we take for granted completely in our everyday lives. And in fact, the word globalization itself has sort of gone out of vogue. It's not really used very much these days because we take it so much for granted. And now, we have reached a point, as you rightly pointed out, sir, where there is a genuine risk that large parts of the workforce are actually going to be put out of action and put out of work. Um, Back in Thomas Friedman's, in the early 2000s, we didn't even have a category of technology called emerging and disruptive tech, EDTs. We do now, and this is exactly what they are doing. They are disrupting labor as we understand it. So at a time like this, it is more important than ever before to start investing in people and building their capacities. Um, just last month, the head of one of India's largest technology services firms called Tata Consultancy Services put out this rather alarmist statement. He said that within 2 years, uh, almost all call center workers in India were going to lose their jobs, and other large chunks of business process outsourcing were also going to increasingly become the province of AI, and you wouldn't really need humans in the loop anymore. Uh, this is a lot of people we are talking about, right? But this is not necessarily a bad thing because history has also told us that when new technologies are introduced, there is for a while a great period of churn. There is a great need for reskilling and upskilling, but ultimately, we always do seem to reach a newer, higher equilibrium where productivity increases, people are retrained, and they ultimately do find newer, higher jobs. In most cases, higher paying jobs than they found earlier. Now we are living through that period now, and I think we do need to sort of steer our journey through this path a little better. What's happening in India now? We do have a problem, absolutely. And I keep referring to the world as flat because that was where the first major public discussion about many of these trends began. Thomas Friedman talked about how as we neared the year 2000, the Indian services came to the attention of the world because large armies of Indian engineers were recruited to fix what was then being called the Millennium Bug or the Y2K bug. All right. And in the years that followed, India became something of a hub for tech services and IT enabled services for the world itself. A problem that had become apparent even that early was that Indian engineers, while we have a lot of engineering institutes and colleges, they are not all employable, which means that the curriculum doesn't necessarily make them industry ready. All right. And today, we are still at a stage when we find that year after year, only about 50% of our graduates are employable. Now that needs to improve because this has impacts on the economy, it has impacts on unemployment, joblessness, and whatnot. Um, Recent surveys have shown that the Indian IT services find that the major barrier to higher, to their growth as they see it, has to do with talent and the talent crunch, the lack of available skill and talent. And they say that 65% of what they consider the barrier is actually attributable to this talent crunch. Uh, this also affects our competitiveness on the world stage. Like among the G20 countries, for example, uh, this skill gap actually poses a year-on-year growth, a growth risk of 2.3% to India's GDP. All right, so it's absolutely imperative that we course correct in terms of skilling. Now, there's a lot that's happening. In India, because we do have a very big divide between, let's say, the skilled and the unskilled. Also, this maps in some ways onto the urban-rural divide, and also the divide, Lorraine, which you talked about between parts of the country that are actually data rich and those on the other side of the digital divide which actually don't have very much access to data. So we really have to work on skilling two very different constituencies here. urban professionals, those working in higher end white collar jobs, and then you have others who belong to rural India for whom digital literacy and more foundational digital skills are actually more important, right? We're actually doing a lot to try and address both because we do fully understand the scope of the problem in India. Um, Now, the pandemic taught us how important e-learning is. Okay, I mean, online learning platforms were used, but not to that extent before COVID hit us in 2020. And after that, the value of online learning and self-paced learning has really become very evident. So what India has done is start a new program in recent years called eSkill India. And eSkill India is a major aggregator. It brings together a lot of professionally focused training platforms, online training platforms, brings them all under this umbrella. And it's also actively sourcing and devising new content for professionals, okay, to equip them better for industry. We have another mega program of this called the Desh Stack. Desh in India means country. And the Desh Stack, once again, is trying to bring together just about all the professional learning content you could have that is generated within India and make much of it available as open source content to potential learners and aspiring learners. When we come to offline and more conventional capacity building, like I said, there are two different groups we need to cater to, the more foundational and the more higher end. And we do have massive projects in both. Okay. For example, efforts are underway. Sorry.
No, okay, no, okay.
Okay, sorry about that. Efforts are underway, for example, to train 10 million students, offer them professional technology training. And much of this is going to focus on AI, machine learning, deep learning, and the other sort of emerging technologies we talked about. But this is where also the role of the private sector becomes so important because in just about every country there is a skill gap. But if the task of developing curricula and developing training materials is left to public institutions of the government only, we will almost always be well behind the curve. All right. So we absolutely need more and more of these public-private partnerships in the area of skilling and skill building to make students more employable. And in India, that's happening in a big way. Just about all the big names, be it Cisco, Microsoft, Intel, LinkedIn, Meta, etc., are all partnering with the government to roll out training programs for students. Students have also made it known, and this is actually very evident through surveys, that they prefer credentials from private company. So it's important for them to have an accreditation or a certificate at the end of their course, which says certified by Microsoft. They see that as having great value in the job market. So it's imperative we do that. Now, the private sector companies are also increasingly working with technology training institutions. The IITs in India are very famous to start these incubators and labs for grooming startups, for teaching young entrepreneurs how to run businesses, etc. When we move to rural India, okay, the needs there are different. Here, the government has a different set of priorities. And unfortunately, private companies are a little less keen to get involved here. But again, they are doing that increasingly. And here, the focus needs to be on digital literacy. We have a massive program which targets people in the age group 14 to 60, for example. And the idea is to make them digitally literate, to sort of use available data, to use basic devices, to access public services through their devices. So all of this is in place. What are the big areas that are important for the next generation in cities who are entering the white collar workforce? We've actually had a number of national level surveys, and the top areas that have emerged are absolutely AI and machine learning. You have robotics, you have big data and analytics, you have cybersecurity, the Internet of Things, and also sort of cloud processing. These are some of the big areas that have emerged from those findings. And of course, the government is working increasingly with private sector in each of these areas to roll out training programs. Something which Lorraine drew attention to was the need for soft skills as well. In a country which produces so many engineers, we often forget the value of communication, of the softer skills needed at the workplace. Leadership, empathy, the basic ability to communicate with colleagues and subordinates and others. This is not an India problem by any means. Klaus Schwab, when he wrote The Fourth Industrial Revolution, did talk about the great pace of technologies and the way tech is combining propelling us into this new industrial revolution. But even he made that point very strongly about the need for these soft skills to go hand in hand with the harder skills and training that you need. This is very important. And the final point with which I'd like to end is, training, not just in the ability to develop technology, not just the kind of thing that engineers do, but also the need to regulate technology. So we need a new cadre of diplomats, of regulators, of policymakers who understand the technology and can regulate for it more efficiently. And this, when it comes to AI, has emerged as a bit of a problem because, see, we see two broad trends. When it comes to the global north, there is a clear sort of dichotomy between innovators and regulators, centers for innovation and centers for regulation. Typically, the US has always been a center for innovation. Even today, most of the world's AI innovation is actually emerging from the US. The EU, on the other hand, is seen more as a center for regulation. And it's no coincidence that the GDPR, the EU's AI Act, have all emerged from there. But this is changing, all right? I mean, there is a blurring of lines between this, what was earlier this clear cut division. And if you look at the last Stanford University AI Index, it shows that the number of AI regulations in the US have jumped since 2016. There were only about 8 regulations there. There are close to 35 today. All right. So, regulation is on the increase there. But how effective are these regulations going to be? I mean, it is for that we need a newly trained generation of regulators and policymakers. The global south presents a dichotomy as well, and this is a slightly different kind of dichotomy. Okay, you have countries which AI regulation actually needs a very nuanced approach, okay, because there are a lot of factors to consider. But when it comes to the global south, we are seeing more and more of a dichotomy between countries that take a very hammer-like approach. I mean, it is a no to everything. And this is because not too much AI innovation is actually emerging from the global south. So we are essentially regulating for a technology that we don't understand entirely. It is not really native to us. It is a foreign technology. Okay, so there tends to be rather forbidding sets of regulations. And then you have other countries within the global south uh, who just defer the idea of regulation altogether. The idea being that, okay, look, this is not something we understand at all. Let us not regulate for it at all. Let us postpone the act of regulating altogether. Now, really, we need to find a middle path between all these different approaches, regulation, innovation, not regulating, regulating too much. And this calls for a different kind of capacity building also as we go ahead. So that is another area in which we need to invest in people strongly. Thank you. So, the question about data control and data manipulation, I think I will very closely echo what Ms. Bagash just said. Data protection laws are a national affair. Okay, so I mean, every country does have its own data protection regimes. In certain cases, like the EU, which is a collective entity, of course, you have the GDPR, which covers EU member states. But otherwise, most countries do have their own data laws, which they have to abide by. Okay. Now, there is obviously a strong need for, and yes, in India, I think so, like you said, it does worry us that much of our data, personal data, often resides on servers that are outside the country. Now, India's position on this has actually changed a little over time. A few years ago, in 2019, when Japan was president of the G20, they put forward this, well, really very progressive and forward-looking idea of data free flow with trust, DFFT. The idea was DFFT was actually going to make cross-border data flows a reality and more possible. At the time, there were 3 countries which did not come on board. India was one of them, India, South Africa, and a third. At the time, we believed quite strongly in the idea of data localization. But over time, our position has changed a little. Okay, we now believe in what is called trusted geographies. So we do believe that there are certain countries that we see as allies, which are safe countries, and we can enter into certain limited kinds of data sharing agreements with them. We now have a new data protection law in place, which came out just last year. It's called the Digital Personal Data Protection Act. And this actually reflects this notion of trusted geographies. Okay, so I mean, we have moved a little closer to the idea of data, cross-border data flows, but just a little. But having said that, there are certain classes of data which we think really do need to be shared across borders, and development data is one of them. Because most of the SDGs talk about issues that are absolutely transnational and cross-border in nature. So here, certain kinds of development data around migration, health, the oceans, terrestrial issues, all of this actually needs to be shared across data, and here across borders. And it's important that open data, to reflect to sort of echo a point that Lorraine had made earlier, actually be made more available. The idea of open data has never quite taken off in the way that it should have. All right, there is still a belief in largely closed data sets. We need more and more of these large open data sets to be made available. And I mean, this is important not just development for also the growth of, but also for the growth of emerging technologies like AI, which are data guzzlers. You need more and more of that. So your point about Starlink, I think this also has to do in some ways with the issue of cybersecurity. Increasingly there are large numbers of data breaches across the world, and the Russia-Ukraine war has seen lots of them. I think Russia knocked out UK's the Ukraine's largest telecom provider for a while, towards the end, and that paralyzed services completely. So again, I mean, there are international mechanisms to strengthen cybersecurity, but countries really have to implement their own national cybersecurity strategies very, very strongly to guard against these kinds of attacks. So I'll just end with that. Yeah.